They say love is the safest place to hide your heart. But what if the person who saves you from loneliness also becomes the reason you forget who you are? This is not a story about villains or betrayal. It's about a woman who had everything she thought she wanted: a gentle husband, a calm home, a life without storms, and yet woke up each day feeling like a stranger inside her own world. Emma didn't marry for love. She married to forget. But love built on silence doesn't heal, it haunts. In a city that never stops moving, she'll have to face the one truth she's spent years avoiding: you can't build a future on someone else's hope. What follows isn't a fairy tale. It's a quiet revolution, a story of guilt, courage, and the painful beauty of starting over. The House with Quiet Walls, a journey through the soft wreckage of a love that was kind, but never true. The rain had been falling since dawn, not hard, just the kind that lingers like an unanswered question. The kind that soaks the pavement in silver and makes everything look softer than it really is. Through the kitchen window, Emma watched the water crawl down the glass in thin, trembling lines. Behind her, the kettle whistled, a lonely sound in a house that had forgotten laughter. She poured the water into a cup and waited for the tea to darken, as if patience could change its taste. Across the counter lay a folded note in Leo's handwriting: "Good morning, sunshine. I made breakfast, see you tonight. Love, L." The word love was written with the same loop he'd used on their wedding invitation. Even now, a year later, he wrote it like a promise. Emma stared at it for a long time, then tucked it under the fruit bowl where it would stay until she decided to throw it away. She didn't mean to be cruel, only careful. Words, she'd learned, could become dangerous when they meant more to one person than the other. Outside, Lincoln Park was waking up. Cars hummed, dogs barked, people hurried past with umbrellas tilted like shields. It was the same neighborhood that had once felt like the start of something: tall trees, bookshops, children's laughter echoing between buildings. Now it felt like a stage set for a play she didn't audition for. When Leo first moved into her apartment, his presence filled the rooms like warm light. He was 32, steady and thoughtful, a man who believed in routines and quiet joys. He brought flowers every Friday because, as he said, there should always be something blooming in a house. He never forgot anniversaries. He never forgot her coffee just the way she liked it: strong, 2 sugars, no milk. He was everything she had once thought she wanted. But somewhere between the wedding vows and the second winter, the air had changed. Not loudly, just subtly, like the way a song fades before you realize it's ending. Now, in the kitchen, Emma could still smell him, that faint mix of soap and cedarwood, and it made her chest tighten in ways that weren't love, only memory. That morning she dressed in silence, pulling her sweater over her head and tying her hair loosely. The mirror by the doorway caught her reflection. She looked fine, maybe even happy to someone who didn't know better. The truth was harder to name. She left the apartment and walked toward the bookstore where she worked. The streets were slick, reflecting the gray sky like a bruise. Inside the shop, the smell of paper and dust greeted her, familiar, comforting, safe. Books never asked for more than attention. Her coworker, Nina, glanced up from the counter. "Rough morning again?" she asked, smiling gently. Emma forced a smile back. "Something like that." Nina didn't press further. She never did. But Emma could feel the question lingering between them, the way people feel thunder before it comes. She shelved new arrivals, wiped tables, answered customers. Routine wrapped itself around her like a blanket, thin, but enough to get through the day. Yet even in the noise of pages turning and footsteps echoing, her mind drifted back home, to the man who waited for her with hope she couldn't return. That evening, when she stepped into the apartment, it smelled of lemon and rosemary. The dining table was set, candles flickering, plates warm, Leo standing there with his gentle grin. "Hey, you're home," he said, his eyes lighting up as if her arrival were the best part of his day. "Dinner's ready. Your favorite chicken pasta." Emma froze in the doorway for a moment. She wanted to match his warmth, to play her part convincingly. That's sweet of you, she managed, her voice soft, careful. He came closer, kissed her forehead. Long day? Just the usual, she said. They sat. He talked about work, about a colleague's new baby, about maybe taking a weekend trip to the lake soon. She nodded at all the right moments, smiled when she should, even laughed once. But somewhere between his stories, her eyes drifted to the candle's flame, small, steady, unaware that it was burning itself out. When dinner was over, Leo reached across the table and took her hand. Emma, he said quietly, you've been distant lately. I know it's been a hard year. But I believe in us. I really do. She looked at his hand on hers, warm, certain, safe, and felt a sting of guilt so sharp it almost drew blood. He deserved more than a woman who smiled out of obligation. I'm just tired, she whispered. He nodded, believing her. That was the worst part, he always believed her. Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed, Emma stood by the window again. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed and shining. Street lights glowed like tiny fires along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded. She opened her journal, the one with the cracked brown cover, and wrote a single line, if love is supposed to feel like coming home, why do I always want to run? The words sat on the page like confession. She stared at them until her eyes blurred. In the bedroom, she could hear Leo breathing evenly, already asleep. She wondered how long she could keep pretending, how long kindness could coexist with emptiness before one destroyed the other. Outside, the city exhaled, a soft wind brushing against the glass. Emma closed her eyes and let it whisper through her like a promise she didn't yet understand. Somewhere deep inside, something small began to shift, not loudly, but enough to make her realize the quiet walls of this house could not hold her forever. The story had begun long before this night, but for Emma, this was the first time she truly felt it, the weight of the life she'd built, and the terrifying freedom that waited beyond it. The morning after the rain, sunlight broke across the apartment in quiet fragments. It touched everything softly, the framed photo from their wedding, the folded blanket on the couch, the vase of fading flowers Leo had bought last Friday. Emma watched the light crawl across the wall as she sipped her coffee. Leo had already left for work, leaving behind his usual traces, the faint smell of aftershave, the clatter of his keys gone quiet, the sound of a man who moved through life with certainty. She envied that certainty. For him, love was simple, and action repeated until it became truth. For her, it had become a careful choreography, smile, nod, speak gently, avoid the spaces where silence grew too loud. Her phone buzzed. A message from Nina. Lunch today? You've been ghosting me. Emma typed back quickly, sure. Noon. Same place. She closed her phone and glanced at the clock. 2 more hours before she had to leave. She filled the time with meaningless tasks, watering plants that were already green, straightening picture frames, folding the dish towels. The rhythm of normalcy was its own disguise. But as she moved through the apartment, she felt watched, not by Leo, not by anyone outside, but by the life itself, the one she'd built out of fear of loneliness. Every object seemed to hold a question she didn't want to answer. How long can you live in a story that isn't yours? At lunch, Nina arrived late, windblown and unbothered. She dropped her bag onto the chair and grinned. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I'm fine, Emma lied, stirring her coffee. You always say that. Nina tilted her head. Is it Leo again? Emma didn't respond immediately. She stared out the cafe window, people walking, children chasing pigeons, a man in a suit arguing with a parking meter. Life moving, hers paused. I think, she started slowly, I think I'm living next to my life, not inside it. Nina leaned back, her smile fading. That's heavy. Emma gave a weak laugh. Everything feels heavy. You need to tell him, Em. I can't. He doesn't deserve that pain. And you don't deserve to disappear in slow motion. Emma said nothing. She watched the condensation form on her coffee cup and wondered how people could end love stories without becoming villains in their own minds. That evening, she came home to find Leo in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, cooking something that smelled like basil and garlic. He turned with that easy, earnest grin. "Surprise dinner night," he said. "No reason. Just because." She smiled, because that's what her role required. He poured her wine, told her about his day, small office dramas, a coworker's promotion, an old friend moving back to town. His voice filled the room with warmth. Emma let it wash over her like background music. When he asked about her day, she hesitated. "Quiet," she said finally. "Just books and customers." He nodded, satisfied with that small truth. Then he leaned on the counter, watching her. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm just tired." "You always say that." His voice softened. "Is it me?" The question landed like a stone dropped into water. She looked at him, at the open face of a man who only wanted to be enough. "No," she said quickly. "Of course not." But the word no didn't feel honest. It hung in the air like smoke, visible, poisonous. He stepped closer, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You know I love you, right?" Her throat tightened. "I know." "Then we'll be okay," he said, as if love alone could rebuild a crumbling wall. Later, after he went to bed, Emma stood at the sink washing dishes she didn't remember dirtying. The city hummed outside, distant traffic, a siren, the muffled laughter of strangers. She turned off the faucet and let the silence press against her. Her reflection in the kitchen window looked foreign, same face, but the eyes carried someone else's story. Someone braver. She dried her hands and reached for her journal again. "I keep waiting to feel something, gratitude, desire, guilt, anything that proves I'm still inside this marriage. But the only thing I feel is the quiet." The pen paused mid-sentence. She could hear Leo's soft breathing from the bedroom. He was the kind of man who dreamed easily. She envied that too. A week later, he came home holding 2 envelopes. "Guess what?" he said. "Weekend trip. Lake Geneva. Just us. We need it." She smiled, a reflex now. "That sounds nice." He kissed her forehead. "Pack light. It'll be good for us." As he left the room, her smile dissolved. The thought of the lake, the same place he'd proposed, filled her with dread. The memory of his promise, "I'll love you forever," echoed like a sentence, not a vow. That night, she dreamt of drowning, not violently, but slowly, like sinking into water that looked calm but stole the air from her lungs. The trip arrived on a Friday. Leo drove with one hand on the wheel and the other occasionally reaching for hers. She looked out the window, trees flickering by, sky heavy with clouds. He hummed along to the radio, oblivious to the quiet storm beside him. At the lake, everything looked postcard perfect. Blue water, green hills, sunlight breaking through clouds. He smiled and said, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" She nodded, because that's what love was supposed to sound like. That night, in the hotel, he gave her a small box. Inside, a silver necklace, a delicate heart. "It reminded me of you," he said. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. But the tears weren't gratitude, they were grief for a man who loved a ghost. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, touched her cheek. "We'll be okay, Emma." "I know we will." She nodded again, but in her chest, a truth pulsed louder than his hope: "I can't do this forever." Outside, waves touched the shore in gentle, endless rhythm. Inside, Emma lay awake beside him, the necklace cold against her skin, a beautiful weight she didn't know how to carry anymore. By morning, she would decide nothing. But somewhere deep inside her, the silence had started to change shape, no longer a cage, but the sound of something beginning to break free. The sound that woke her wasn't loud, just the faint clatter of a glass falling in the sink. But for Emma, it felt like thunder. She sat up, disoriented, the hotel room dim except for the gray dawn leaking through the curtains. Leo stood by the counter, picking up shards. "Sorry," he said with a quiet laugh. "Guess I'm clumsy before coffee." He didn't notice her eyes, how they stayed on him like she was seeing something she hadn't before, not his face, but his faith. The gentle certainty that everything broken could be fixed if handled carefully enough. She envied that, but today it frightened her. Because for the first time, she realized she wasn't clumsy, she was careful enough to live an entire life pretending she didn't want to run. And now, she was tired. Breakfast was silent. Leo talked about taking the ferry, about hiking the ridge, about how clear the water looked that morning. Emma nodded when she had to, but her hands trembled around her coffee cup. When he excused himself to take a shower, she slipped outside onto the balcony. The lake below was a mirror, too calm, too honest. She pressed her palms to the cold railing, breathing shallowly. The necklace he'd given her last night hung around her throat, glinting softly in the pale light. It was beautiful. It was suffocating. She unclasped it slowly, feeling the metal slip against her skin. For a moment she just held it, the tiny silver heart catching the light. Then, before she could think, she opened her hand and watched it fall. It hit the wooden deck below with a dull, final sound. Something inside her broke open, not regret, not guilt, just clarity. On the drive back to Chicago, Leo was full of stories, of future plans. "We should go again in spring," he said. "Or maybe somewhere different, New York, maybe? You've always wanted to see a Broadway show." Emma looked out the window. The sky was streaked with blue and gray, the colors of indecision. "I don't know, Leo," she said softly. He glanced at her, confused. "About New York?" "About everything." He laughed a little, assuming she was joking. "You and your moods." But she wasn't smiling. He caught that, and his laughter faded. "Emma," he said gently, "what's wrong?" She opened her mouth, but the words jammed in her throat. It wasn't the right place, wasn't the right time, but when is it ever? "Nothing," she said. "I'm just tired." The lie tasted old now. That night, she couldn't sleep. Leo was beside her, breathing softly, one arm draped over her waist. His touch was light, but it felt like a chain. She stared at the ceiling, her pulse hammering. "I can't keep doing this," she thought. She slipped out of bed quietly and went to the kitchen. The city outside was still awake, sirens in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog, the hum of lights. She sat at the table and opened her journal. "I keep choosing silence because it's easier than pain. But silence is also a kind of cruelty." Her hand shook as she wrote. She wanted to tear the page out, to burn it. But instead, she turned it over and began a letter. "Leo, you deserve to be loved by someone who doesn't have to pretend. You have given me peace, patience, and kindness, and I gave you only a performance of love. I'm sorry for that. Tomorrow, I'll tell you the truth." She folded the page and slid it into a book on the table, the same one he'd gifted her when they first started dating. A small mercy, maybe. But morning had its own plans. Leo woke early and found her already dressed. "You're up," he said, smiling. "Big day?" She hesitated. "I was thinking, we should talk." "Of course," he said easily. "Over breakfast?" He poured coffee, humming under his breath. She sat at the table, watching the steam rise from her cup like a fragile promise. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down, smiled faintly. "My mom," he said, typing quickly. "She wants to visit this weekend." "I told her yes, she misses you." Emma's stomach turned. She pictured herself sitting beside Leo, pretending again, smiling through small talk, hearing his mother say, "You're such a lovely couple." "Leo," she said. Her voice cracked slightly. "Please don't." He froze, phone halfway to his ear. "Don't what?" "Don't tell her to come." He frowned. Why not? She exhaled shakily. Because by then, I might not be here. The words landed heavy, real. The kind that can't be taken back. He set his phone down slowly, confusion giving way to something raw. What are you saying? Her eyes filled. I'm saying I can't keep pretending. I can't live like this anymore. For a second, the world stopped moving, just the faint hum of the refrigerator, the city breathing beyond the window. Leo stepped forward, his voice low. Emma, please don't do this. We can fix it. Whatever's wrong, No, she interrupted, her voice trembling but steady. That's the problem. You keep trying to fix something that shouldn't have been built this way. He stared at her, disbelief, pain, love, all tangled in one expression. You don't mean that. I do. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything they'd both been afraid to say. Finally, Leo nodded slowly, as if accepting a verdict he already knew was coming. Then say it, he whispered. Say it, so I can stop hoping. Tears blurred her vision. She looked straight at him. I don't love you, Leo. He closed his eyes. A single tear slid down his cheek, but his voice was calm. I know. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then Leo reached out, touched her shoulder gently, and said, Thank you for telling me. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, just understanding. When he walked out of the kitchen, the air felt different, thinner, cleaner. Emma stood alone, her breath shaking. She'd broken something good. But for the first time in years, she'd also told the truth. Outside, sunlight cut through the clouds, landing on the floor in pale gold streaks. She looked down at the light and whispered, almost to herself, It's finally morning. And this time, she almost believed it. The apartment had never been so quiet. No clinking of spoons in coffee mugs. No music humming from the kitchen speaker. No laughter, only the hollow sound of rain ticking against the glass. Leo had gone to stay with a friend for a few days, he'd said. He needed space, though he didn't use the word hurt. Emma knew better. Space was what people asked for when their world had caved in and they were trying not to drown in the debris. She moved through the rooms carefully, as if afraid of breaking the silence that still smelled faintly of him. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His coffee mug, the one that said Best Morning Starts Here, sat in the sink, half-washed. She couldn't bring herself to finish cleaning it. Every object in the house was a memory she didn't want but couldn't throw away. That night, she sat on the couch with her knees drawn up, the television flashing scenes she didn't really watch. Her phone buzzed. Nina, you okay? Emma typed, deleted, then finally sent, no. But maybe that's a start. A few seconds later, Nina, want me to come over? Emma hesitated. She wanted company but also silence, the kind where no one expected her to speak. Not tonight, she wrote. I just need to think. The dots blinked, then disappeared. Nina understood. The days blurred. She went to work, pretended everything was normal, smiled at customers who didn't look long enough to see the crack beneath it. But inside, something kept collapsing. She would pick up a book, only to realize she'd been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. She'd walk home from work, see couples laughing under umbrellas, and feel an ache so deep it bordered on nausea. Guilt followed her like a second shadow. Not for telling the truth, but for the man she had broken with it. Leo had loved her the way sunlight loves a plant, faithfully, daily, without question. And she had given him shade. On the fourth day, he called. Hey, he said, voice quiet, measured. I just wanted to know if you're okay. Emma closed her eyes. I'm trying. A pause. So am I. She could hear the sound of traffic behind him, the soft whistle of wind through the receiver. For a moment she pictured him walking down the street, his coat collar turned up, his hands buried in his pockets, the same way he used to when they first met. Leo, she said, her voice breaking, I never wanted to hurt you. I know. Another pause. But you did. The words landed gently, without blame, and that made them hurt more. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know that too, he said. Then, softly, I just don't know what to do with all this love now. She didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between them, two people holding the same wound from opposite sides. Finally, he said, I'll come by tomorrow to get some of my things. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. His voice trembled once, then steadied. Good night, Emma. Good night. When the call ended, she realized her hands were shaking. The next morning, she woke early and began cleaning, obsessively, almost frantically, as if scrubbing the surfaces might erase the ghosts. She folded towels, wiped the counters, rearranged books. When she got to the bedroom, she stopped. The bed looked too large. His pillow still had the faintest indentation where his head used to rest. She sat down, running her fingers along the sheet, and whispered to the empty air, I did love something, just not the way you needed. Tears slipped down, silent, uninvited. She didn't hear the door open until Leo's voice broke the stillness. Emma? She startled, stood quickly, wiping her face. Hey. He stood in the doorway, shoulders heavy but eyes calm, not angry, not accusing. Just tired. He looked around, as if memorizing everything one last time. I'll just grab my stuff, he said softly. She nodded. Okay. He walked past her, moving with the careful rhythm of someone trying not to disturb something fragile. He picked up a few shirts, his charger, a book, the small plant from the windowsill he'd insisted on naming Charlie. When he turned to leave, his gaze landed on the mug in the sink. He smiled faintly. You never finished cleaning that. I couldn't, she admitted. Keep it, he said after a moment. Maybe it'll remind you that mornings can still be good. Her breath caught. Leo, he looked up, waiting. I wish I'd met you when I was whole. He exhaled slowly. You did. You just didn't know it yet. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The city hummed faintly outside, horns, voices, life continuing. Then Leo stepped closer, brushed his thumb lightly against her cheek, and whispered, Take care of yourself, Emma. And just like that, he was gone. The door closed softly behind him, not a slam, not a finality, but a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. Emma stood there, frozen. The air felt lighter, almost unreal. She looked around, same walls, same light, but everything had changed. She walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the glass. The world outside was moving on schedule, indifferent to her private earthquake. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include him, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Maybe she would take the writing class Nina had been talking about. Maybe she would move closer to the lake. Maybe, just maybe, she would start again. But for now, she simply stood in that small apartment, listening to the silence, not as punishment, but as proof that she was still here. It was a heavy silence, yes, but underneath it, there was something else beginning to hum, the faint, unfamiliar sound of freedom. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like running from it. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning, the calls to family, the explanations, the questions. But tonight, the house of echoes belonged to her. And for one fragile, flickering moment, she let herself breathe without pretending. The sky over Chicago was the color of smoke, pale, indecisive, stretched thin across the city. Emma stood by her window, coffee cooling in her hands, watching a woman across the street hang white sheets on a balcony. They fluttered like ghosts. It had been a week since Leo left, but the apartment still breathed in his rhythm, the way she did laundry on Saturdays because he liked fresh sheets on Sundays, the way she reached for 2 cups instead of 1. The absence wasn't loud, it was structural, like missing a wall you once leaned on. The world, indifferent as ever, moved forward. But Emma felt suspended, between guilt and relief, between endings and what might come after. That morning, she finally opened the book where she had hidden a letter, the one she never gave Leo. Her own handwriting stared back at her like a mirror she'd been avoiding. You deserve to be loved without apology. Her chest tightened. She folded the letter once, twice, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Something inside her whispered, "You still owe him the truth that isn't wrapped in goodbye." By late afternoon, the air turned heavy with rain. Emma walked through Lincoln Park, shoes brushing against wet leaves, mind spinning through memories that no longer fit neatly anywhere. She found herself standing outside the small cafe where she and Leo had once spent lazy Sunday mornings. The sign buzzed faintly, the glass door was fogged from warmth inside. She hadn't planned to come here, but something drew her, perhaps the unfinished business between grief and grace. She pushed the door open. The bell chimed. And there he was. Leo sat by the window, reading a newspaper, his coffee untouched. He looked up, startled, then something softer took over his face. "Emma," he said, almost a whisper. She froze, halfway between walking forward and running away. "Hey," she managed, voice low. "Sit," he said, motioning to the empty chair across from him. The rain outside began to fall harder, drumming against the glass. She sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "How have you been?" She gave a small, honest shrug. "Learning how to be someone." He smiled faintly. "That's a good start." His calm unnerved her, not because it lacked emotion, but because it carried too much restraint. He wasn't the same man who waited for her smiles. This one had seen through illusion and decided to stay gentle anyway. "I found something," she said quietly, pulling the folded letter from her pocket. "I wrote this before I told you the truth. I never gave it to you." He didn't reach for it. "Do you want to read it?" She hesitated. "If that's okay." He nodded. Her voice trembled at first but grew steadier as the words took shape. "You deserve to be loved without apology. You gave me warmth when I was cold, patience when I was lost. But love shouldn't be a kindness owed, it should be a fire shared. I tried to light it, Leo. I really did. But my match burned out before it reached you." Her voice broke. "I wanted you to hear that." He sat still, his eyes fixed on hers. Then he said softly, "You always spoke beautifully, even when it hurt." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know." He exhaled, slow. "I spent the last week trying to be angry. It didn't work." "Why not?" "Because you never lied about the kind of person you were. I just didn't want to believe you." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I was scared." "I know that too." He smiled small, sad, unbroken. "And now?" She took a breath. "Now I think I'm done being afraid of being alone." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Then I'm happy for you." The rain outside softened. The cafe was half empty, the air warm with coffee and quiet. Emma wanted to memorize this, not as a wound, but as a moment that finally stopped bleeding. She reached across the table and took his hand, not in love, but in gratitude. "You were the kindest chapter of my life," she said. "But if I keep rereading it, I'll never write another." He swallowed hard, then squeezed her hand once. "Then write something good." They both laughed through tears, small, disbelieving, human. When they stood to leave, Leo reached into his coat and pulled something out, the necklace, its silver heart glinting in the dim light. "You dropped this," he said gently. "The manager found it outside the hotel. I thought about keeping it, but I think it belongs with you." Emma stared at it, the delicate chain, the quiet shimmer. For a second she saw the girl who'd once worn it, afraid to speak her truth. She shook her head. "It belongs to who we were. Let's leave it there." He nodded. "Okay." He placed it on the table between them, a tiny monument to what they had been. Then, without another word, they walked outside together. The rain had stopped, the sky was clearing in streaks of pale gold. The world smelled like beginnings. At the corner, they paused. "This is where we say goodbye," she said softly. Leo smiled. "Goodbye doesn't have to mean gone forever. Sometimes it just means free." She nodded. "Goodbye, Leo." "Goodbye, Emma." They turned in opposite directions. As she walked away, she didn't look back, not out of pride, but out of peace. The city shimmered around her, every sound sharper, every breath fuller. For the first time in years, the weight on her chest had changed shape. It wasn't pain anymore, it was air. When she reached the lake, the wind lifted her hair and carried the scent of rain and earth. She stood there for a long time, watching ripples spread across the water, one after another, quiet and unstoppable. She whispered into the wind, "Thank you." It wasn't to Leo. It wasn't to love. It was to herself, for finally choosing truth over safety, honesty over comfort. And as the last light of day touched the water, Emma smiled, not because she was happy, but because she was finally real. The city lights flickered on, one by one. And somewhere between their glow and her reflection, she felt it, the exact moment when a heart learns how to be its own home. It was late winter when Emma finally moved into her new place, a narrow studio with one wide window that opened toward the city skyline. The walls were still bare, the air smelled faintly of paint and paper, and every sound of footsteps, laughter from the street below, echoed like a heartbeat inside her small new world. She stood by the window on her first morning there, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching sunlight crawl across the floor. It felt different now, not the hesitant light that once slipped through the blinds of the apartment she'd shared with Leo, but something cleaner, sharper, hers. There was no trace of their old life here. She hadn't brought the photos, or the blue vase, or the wedding china that always looked too fragile to use. Just a few books, a notebook, and the courage to start again. She thought of Leo sometimes, not with pain, but with a quiet affection, like remembering a song that once meant something. He had written once after their cafe meeting. A short message, "I hope the new place has good light. You always loved mornings." She never replied. She didn't need to. Some goodbyes didn't require echoes, they only needed peace. Every Sunday, Emma went for long walks by the lake. She'd found a path that wound through the trees, where the air smelled of cold earth and water. It was the same lake where Leo had once slipped a ring on her finger, where she'd once whispered promises she couldn't keep. Now she came not to remember, but to breathe. On those mornings, she carried her notebook, writing small fragments that weren't quite stories yet, lines about freedom, about silence, about how some hearts break not because they're weak, but because they've outgrown their cages. Sometimes she'd read those lines aloud, just to hear them exist in the world. It made her feel less like a ghost of her past, and more like someone rebuilding language from the rubble of her own mistakes. One afternoon, while walking home from work, she passed by a bookstore window and stopped short. A poster read, "Local Writers' Night, read your work." She stood there, heart pounding. Her reflection looked back at her through the glass, steady, older, softer. The thought terrified her. But fear, she realized, had been the architect of her entire old life. And she was done letting it design her days. That night, she signed up. The event was held a week later in a dim little cafe behind the bookstore. There were mismatched chairs, the smell of espresso, and a small microphone that squealed every time someone adjusted it. When it was her turn, Emma stepped onto the tiny platform. Her palms were damp. Her heartbeat was an earthquake. She unfolded the paper in her hands, a short essay she'd titled "The Space Between Love and Freedom." She looked at the audience, strangers sipping coffee, nodding politely, and took a breath. Once, she began, I lived in a house that was too quiet. It was filled with love, but not the kind that belonged to me. And I learned that love, when borrowed, can be as heavy as loneliness. The room went still. She continued, not as a performance, but as confession. We don't always destroy people by hating them. Sometimes, we destroy them by staying where we shouldn't. By pretending. By confusing gratitude for devotion. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. If you've ever left someone kind, not because they were cruel but because you were lost, you know what it's like to live with that ache. But you also know that sometimes honesty is the most painful form of love. When she finished, there was no applause at first, just silence. Then, slowly, the audience began to clap, soft, understanding, human. Emma smiled through tears. The sound was gentle, not triumphant. But for her, it felt like flight. Later that night, she walked home alone. The city was quiet, the streets glistening under a light drizzle. She passed the park where she and Leo had once sat on a bench, laughing about nothing. The bench was empty now, wet with rain. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. When she reached her apartment, she lit a small candle and placed it on the windowsill. Its flame flickered against the glass, casting a faint reflection, her face illuminated, steady. On her desk lay a package she'd never opened, the small box containing the silver necklace Leo had once given her, returned to her by Nina after months. She hesitated, then opened it. The tiny heart gleamed under the candlelight, still perfect, still cold. She traced its shape with her thumb and smiled. It wasn't pain anymore. It was history. She placed it inside her drawer, beside her notebooks, not to forget, but to remember differently. That night, Emma wrote one final entry in her journal, the same one she'd started on the night she first doubted her happiness. Maybe love isn't always about forever. Maybe it's about the courage to recognize when forever ends. I used to think honesty was destruction, but now I see it's a doorway. I walked through mine, and on the other side, there was light. She closed the journal, blew out the candle, and let the room fall into darkness. For a long while, she just listened to the faint hum of the city, to her own slow breathing, to the sound of rain beginning again. And in that dark, something small and steady began to grow, not joy, not yet, but peace. The kind of peace that doesn't ask questions. The kind that simply stays. Weeks later, spring arrived. The air grew softer, the city louder, life uncoiling itself again. Emma sat by the window one morning, notebook open, watching the sunrise stain the skyline gold. In the margin of a fresh page, she wrote the last line she would need for a long time: I am not healed, but I am free. And maybe that's what healing really is. She leaned back, smiling faintly, as light filled the room, warm, patient, and utterly her own. The city outside was waking. A new day had begun. And for the first time in a long time, Emma didn't feel like part of someone else's story. She felt like the author. Never stay in a love built only on gratitude or fear of being alone. Real love can't grow where honesty is missing, and silence, no matter how gentle, still breaks hearts. Sometimes, walking away isn't cruelty, it's courage.